House prices have stalled, interest rates are going up, and every year there's another rule landlords have to follow, which is why so many property investors feel like the country is rigged against us. And there's no place we feel that more than at the Tenancy Tribunal, the Judge Judy for property investors, where you walk in feeling like you're about to get a beating. But is the system really rigged? I analysed 1,000 cases to find out, and the results, honestly, they weren't what I expected. Here's what I found. Go to any property forum or Facebook group in New Zealand and you'll find landlord after landlord saying the same thing. The rules are biased in favour of tenants. But before we look for bias, you really need to know what the Tenancy Tribunal actually does, because this is where every dispute between a landlord and a tenant ends up. Unpaid rent, damage, bond fights. An adjudicator decides who's in the wrong and how much they owe. And this actually gets pretty serious. The tribunal can force you to pay your landlord or tenant up to $100,000. And you can understand people thinking the system is rigged when a landlord rented out a small one-bedroom flat behind their house. The tenant lived there pretty happily for 9 years, never raised a problem. Then, just as the tenant was about to move out, they take the landlord to the Tenancy Tribunal. And they were arguing that the flat that they'd lived in for 9 years was an unlawful dwelling because it didn't have its own letterbox, its own address, or its own rubbish bins. Now, the landlord pushed back because they had a code compliance certificate. As far as they knew, it was completely legal. But here's the catch. At some point, a cooker and an oven had been added to the unit. The landlord didn't get the right bit of paper from the council, so the tribunal said the whole thing was illegal and made the landlord pay back the tenant almost 60 grand in rent. So you give someone a home for 9 years, they pay rent happily, never complain, then you owe them nearly 60 grand over an oven. Well, you can see why some people feel that it's rigged. But is that just a one-off, or does this happen all the time? So I went to the tribunal and asked them for data about who wins most often. Is it tenants or landlords? Now, they said they don't see it as winning or losing, and I think, yeah, right, tell that to the landlord who had to pay their tenants 60 grand. That guy felt like he'd lost that day. So I said to them instead, okay, you look at 29,000 or so cases every single year. How many times do landlords have to pay out their tenants? And how many times do tenants have to pay the landlords? Well, they said they didn't track that data. So I think, well, bugger this. If the government won't give me the numbers, I'll go get them myself. Because every single tribunal decision is actually published online. You can search them yourself. But there are tens of thousands of them, and reading every single one could take over a year and a half. So I hired a data scraper, this Russian guy who lives in Greece, who I paid through a Lithuanian bank account in US dollars, which kind of sounds like the plot of a thriller movie. But remember, I'm a property economist. I've got to find some way to make my job sound sexy. So we pulled down 1,000 recent tribunal cases, and then I used AI and hand-checked a sample to get the data the government claimed it didn't have, including who tends to win and how much they get paid. And here's what those 1,000 cases tell us. It turns out that 77% of the time, it's the landlord taking the tenant to the tribunal, not the other way around. So the idea that there's this army of vigilante tenants out there hunting down landlords, that doesn't really stack up. But the fact that landlords file more cases, well, that doesn't mean there's no bias at all, right? To figure that out, we've got to look at who wins. And one way to do that is to look at who has to pay the money. Well, in over 4 out of 5 cases at the tribunal, someone ends up paying the other person money. Now, if we find that tenants tend to walk away from the tribunal with more money than landlords, then there could be a case that the whole system's biased. But actually, what I found challenged that entirely, because in almost 9 out of 10 times that money changes hands, it's the tenant who has to pay the landlord. Only 13% of the time was it the other way around. Which is why in the average case, tenants pay landlords around $1,800. So at first glance, you'd say, well, maybe the Tenancy Tribunal is pro-landlord. But remember that landlords bring most of the cases in the first place, and so of course they've got to get paid more often because you only take a case to the Tenancy Tribunal if you think that you're potentially owed something. Which is why, to see if the tribunal really is biased, we need to look at the win rate. And if you're enjoying this, do me a quick favor, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell. That's how I know which videos to make more of. So if you're a landlord or a tenant and you go to the Tenancy Tribunal, how likely are you to win? And by win, we mean how likely is it that you're going to walk away with money? And this is the number that really surprised me, because when a tenant files a case, they win 73% of the time. But when a landlord files a case, they win 98% of the time. So out of every 100 landlords who walk in, 98 walk out with money. Out of every 100 tenants who file, only 73 do. So I'm looking for evidence that the Tenancy Tribunal is rigged. But so far, I'm not finding it. And the numbers hold up in real cases. Take a landlord in Auckland. Their tenant had racked up nearly 50 grand in unpaid rent. Now, there was a personal relationship there and some genuine medical hardship along the way. None of it changed the outcome, though. The tribunal ordered the tenant to pay $46,000 immediately to the landlord, and the landlord got 100% of what they asked for. And these aren't rare. Cases like this happen at the tribunal every single year. They just don't make the news because nobody clicks when you see a headline that says landlord wins or landlord gets what they want. Now, landlords aren't imagining things, right? Because there is some, what I think is unfairness in the system, but it's just not where you think it is. So picture this. You've got a 15-year-old dishwasher in your rental. The tenant smashes it up. You want them to pay for a new one, or at least replace it with a similar one. Now, that might seem pretty fair if they intentionally broke it, but the tribunal won't make them pay, because that dishwasher was 15 years old. On paper, it's fully depreciated. It's not worth anything, at least from an accounting perspective. So even though it's going to cost you money to replace the dishwasher, whether with a new one or even a second-hand one and replace like for like, the tribunal won't make the tenant pay you a cent because it wasn't worth anything, at least on paper, to begin with. So you could have to spend real money even though you did nothing wrong. But that isn't actually biased. That's just how the law is written. So that's where I can see a difference between what might feel fair and what the law just actually says. And there was this other case where a tenant had emptied out the house, moved out, didn't tell anyone, just left the keys on the bench. And common sense would tell you that they've abandoned the property, so the landlord should get the property back and be able to rent it out to someone else, because while the tenants abandoned the property, that landlord's getting no rent. But the tribunal ruled that there wasn't enough evidence to say that the property was abandoned. So the landlord had to wait for a full hearing before they could go looking for that other tenant. Now, that could take 10 weeks. That's 10 weeks of lost rent. On a $600 a week property, that's $6 grand gone that you'll never get back. That's real, and it's worth being upset about, but it's not the adjudicator necessarily picking a side. It's the system drowning in more cases than it can realistically hear. So if the tribunal isn't rigged, what should you do differently? Well, one thing above all is turn up with evidence. I mean, the tribunal doesn't appear to be biased from my numbers, but it does run on proof. So photos, invoices, inspection reports, bond paperwork, every one of those big landlord wins I showed you, the landlord walked in with a folder full of evidence. Because if it comes down to a he said, she said, it could go either way. Look, honestly, I went looking for evidence that the Tenancy Tribunal is biased against landlords. I couldn't find it. But sometimes the truth is that we don't like the law as it's written, and when the rules go our way, we call them fair, and when they don't, we call them rigged. But that's not the same as biased. But one of the other things that really annoys me in New Zealand is when the media says that landlords are screwing New Zealand. I went looking for the data and I covered it in the next video, so click the video on your screen and watch that next.